Grown folks can be just as cruel as children. They're just better at hiding the knife behind a polite smile and a glass of expensive champagne. When 27-year-old Phoebe Aldrin, a part-time art teacher at the poorest community center on Chicago's South Side, stood on the stage of the city's most prestigious charity gala and admitted she'd grown up in the foster care system, the room of 300 people didn't erupt in laughter. It did something worse. It went quiet. They looked at her in the only black dress she owned, her dark brown hair braided in a ruche, her worn-out canvas shoes lost in a sea of designer heels and cashmere, and they looked at her the way you'd look at a stain on a white silk tablecloth, something that needed to be wiped away before someone took a photo. Neil Pemberton, the chairman of the Lakewood Foundation, the man who'd invited her on stage with the warmest smile in the room just minutes ago, was standing right next to her, microphone in hand, and every question he asked landed soft and precise like a scalpel cutting through skin without anesthesia. He didn't need to shout. He just needed to ask the right question, in the right place, in front of the right people, and let the whole room turn itself into a courtroom. A woman at the third table leaned into her friend's ear and whispered just loud enough for Phoebe to hear that she was nothing but a foster kid, taking dirty money to run finger-painting classes for street children. Quiet laughter rippled through the room like a cold draft. Nobody stood up for her. Not a single soul. Phoebe stepped off that stage with trembling hands and bloodshot eyes, but she didn't shed a single tear, because she'd learned a long time ago that crying in front of people who want to see you break is giving them exactly what they came for. But what she didn't know was that at the back entrance of that grand ballroom, a man in a tailored three-piece suit with a barbed wire tattoo hidden beneath his sleeve, a man half this city owed money to, and the other half prayed they'd never have to meet, had heard every single whispered insult, and he didn't come alone. If this story's already got you hooked, smash that like button right now to support the channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your sign. But to understand why Phoebe Aldrin was standing on that stage that night, we need to go back 3 weeks, to an ordinary morning like every other morning in her life. Every day, Phoebe woke up at 6 o'clock in the tiny studio on the 3rd floor of an old building on the south side of Chicago, where the rusted pipes sometimes groaned in the middle of the night, and the paint peeled from the walls in patches, as if the walls themselves had grown tired of trying to stay upright. The room had just enough space for a single bed, an old easel she had found in a dumpster behind the community college, and Pepper, a blind cat she had found in the alley behind the laundromat 2 years ago. Pepper couldn't see light, but every morning it still sat right beside the window, facing the sun, as if it remembered warmth even after forgetting color. Phoebe often watched the cat do that while making coffee with a cheap kettle, and every time she watched, she wondered whether she was like Pepper, always turning her face toward something warm, even when she wasn't sure it was really there. At 7 o'clock in the morning, she rode her old bicycle, with the front tire a little flat and the brakes squeaking, across 12 streets to Southside Community Arts Center. The community center stood between a closed liquor store and an empty lot overgrown with weeds, its front painted yellow but already faded gray with time. Inside, the hallway was narrow, the ceiling low, the smell of cheap bleach mixing with the smell of old plastic from the warped floor mats. But the art room at the end of the hallway was different. The art room was the only place in the whole building that had color. The children's paintings hung from clotheslines stretched across the room, blue, red, yellow, purple, one layer over another, and whenever morning sunlight slipped through the dusty window frame and fell across those pictures, the whole room lit up like an entirely different world. Phoebe taught free art classes to about 15 children in the neighborhood, part-time, earning just enough to pay rent for the studio and buy instant noodles. She never complained. To Phoebe, this art room wasn't a workplace. This was where she existed. Among the 15 children was Josie Gutierrez, 8 years old, who lived with her grandmother Rosa in an apartment 3 streets from the center. Josie was the smallest child in the class and the quietest. She usually sat at the corner of the last table, head lowered as she drew without looking at anyone, and every picture she finished had only one color, gray, because in the old box of crayons Rosa had bought from a thrift store, the gray crayon was the only one still long enough to hold and still strong enough to color. Phoebe noticed that not because Josie said it, but because she saw the crayon box. One afternoon after class, when the art room was empty, Phoebe sat down beside Josie and opened the box. She took out the 3 remaining crayons, a red one worn down to half its size, a blue one almost out of color, and a yellow one broken in 2 but still usable, then taught Josie how to blend colors. She showed the little girl how to shade lightly with the red, then layer yellow over it, how to use her finger to smooth the two colors together. Josie followed, slowly, carefully, and when she lifted her finger, a warm streak of orange appeared on the paper, something Josie had never been able to make before. The little girl looked up at Phoebe, eyes wide. "Is this right?" Phoebe smiled. "There's no wrong color, Josie." That day, Josie drew a sun. For the first time, it wasn't gray. It was yellow, a little smudged, a little crooked, but it was a sun, and it was shining. Phoebe pinned the drawing to the clothesline in the middle of the room, and when she stepped back to look at it, she felt something warm rise in her chest. Something she couldn't name, only knew that it felt like the reason she woke up every morning. But that reason was about to be taken away. The next afternoon, the center director called Phoebe into his office. He sat behind a desk piled with papers, took off his glasses to wipe them, put them back on, then took them off again, as if he didn't want to see clearly what he was about to say. The budget had run out. The main donor had withdrawn last quarter. Without new funding within 2 months, the free art program would be cut. Phoebe sat and listened without saying anything. She stepped out into the hallway and stood in front of the glass door of the art room, looking inside. The children were drawing. Josie was sitting at the corner of the last table, head lowered, the broken yellow crayon in her hand. And Phoebe thought, this is the only thing she had ever built in her life. The only thing with color in a life that had been all gray. And it was about to disappear. The person who brought Phoebe the news wasn't the center director, wasn't a charity organization, but Margot Pemberton, 28 years old, the only daughter of Neil Pemberton, chairman of the Lakewood Foundation, one of the largest charitable foundations in Chicago. Margot had appeared at the community center a few weeks prior, in spotless white sneakers that had clearly never touched a sidewalk, and with a smile so wide Phoebe could almost see the word volunteer glowing across her forehead. Margot didn't come because of the children. She came because she needed a line on her resume, a pretty photo beside poor children to post on her personal page around Thanksgiving. Phoebe knew that. But Phoebe also knew that when the budget was running out, you didn't have the right to be picky about allies. So when Margot stopped by the art room that afternoon and said her father's foundation might fund the program, that Lakewood Foundation was looking for community projects to support, and that all Phoebe needed to do was attend a small cocktail party on the rooftop of the Drake Hotel to present the project to a few donors, Phoebe didn't refuse. She had no other choice. The problem was that Phoebe didn't own a single thing suitable for stepping onto the rooftop of the Drake. She had 3 sweaters, 2 pairs of jeans, and a pair of canvas shoes with worn-down heels. The night before the party, she knocked on the door of her second-floor neighbor, a retired Polish woman named Edna, and borrowed the black dress Edna had last worn at her husband's funeral 6 years ago. The dress was 2 sizes too large for Phoebe. She sat on the floor of her studio until midnight, needle and thread in her hands, Pepper curled beside her, making one stitch after another to take in the waist so it would fit. When she stood in front of the only mirror in the shared bathroom at the end of the hallway, the dress still wasn't perfect. The seam pulled a little crooked at the hip, and one side of the hem hung longer than the other, but it was the best thing she had. The rooftop of the Drake was another world. Soft golden lights, sparkling crystal glasses, the scent of expensive perfume mixed with Cuban cigar smoke, and the laughter of people who had never once had to worry about next month's rent. Phoebe stepped out of the elevator and immediately felt as if she were wearing a costume no one was fooled by. She tried to blend into the crowd for 15 minutes, holding the sparkling water a server had handed her, nodding politely at unfamiliar faces, but every glance that passed over her stopped on her canvas shoes a few seconds too long. Finally, she retreated to the balcony, where the wind from Lake Michigan blew cold, and the noise inside became only a dull hum behind her, and she breathed out as if she had been holding her breath for the entire 15 minutes. She wasn't alone out there. A man stood in the corner of the balcony, leaning against the railing and smoking a cigar. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with short black hair, 2 days of unshaved stubble, and a charcoal 3-piece suit tailored so perfectly it looked cut to every line of his body. He seemed as if he belonged there and didn't belong there at the same time, as if he could buy the entire party but couldn't be bothered to participate in it. He didn't look at Phoebe when she stepped outside, didn't nod in greeting, didn't say anything. That silence, somehow, made Phoebe feel more able to breathe than any greeting inside. After a while, he spoke, his eyes still fixed on the city. You don't look like you're having a good time. Phoebe almost laughed. Is it that obvious? The shoes. He said only 2 words, then turned to look at her. Not with judgment, but with the gaze of someone recognizing his own kind. Someone else standing on the edge of a room where they didn't belong. I'm here for work, Phoebe said, and she didn't know why she was explaining herself to a stranger. I teach art to children at a community center on the south side. The program is about to lose funding. Someone said I might find a donor here. He nodded slightly. And did you find one? I found a lot of champagne, and a lot of people who look through me. He let out a small laugh. Not a polite social laugh, but the laugh of someone who genuinely found it funny. What do you teach them? And Phoebe told him. She hadn't meant to say much, but once she started talking about the children, about the art room, about the paintings hanging from clotheslines, her voice changed. It brightened. It warmed. She told him about Josie, the little girl who was 8 years old and had only an old box of crayons, with one usable gray crayon left, and how Phoebe had taught Josie to blend colors from the broken crayons that remained. And the moment Josie drew her first yellow sun and looked up to ask, "Is this right?" Phoebe spoke, and forgot that she was standing on the rooftop of a luxury hotel with a man whose name she didn't know. She only remembered that yellow sun. The man listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't give polite nods, didn't check his watch. He listened in a way very few people listened, with complete stillness. And when Phoebe stopped because she suddenly realized she had said too much, he asked only one question. The girl with the yellow sun, she still comes to class? Every day. He looked at Phoebe for another second, then nodded, as if that answer had confirmed something he had been weighing. I'm in the restaurant business, he said. Garrett. Just one name. No last name. No business card. Phoebe shook his hand, gave him her own name, and realized his grip was firm and rough, in a way that didn't feel like the hand of a man who only opened restaurants. A few minutes later, Margot called Phoebe back inside to introduce her to another donor, and Phoebe walked away, looking back once. Garrett was still standing on the balcony, his cigar gone out, his eyes following her. When the balcony door closed, he turned toward the inside, where Douglas Buck Tanner stood leaning against the glass wall, hands in his pockets, face expressionless. Find out who she is, Garrett said. Buck asked, his voice as even as if he were asking the time. How much do you want to know? Everything. 3 days after the rooftop party at the Drake, a glossy black SUV parked right in front of Southside Community Arts Center. The vehicle looked as out of place in that neighborhood as a wolf standing among sheep, its hood reflecting the morning sunlight, while both sides of the street were lined with storefronts, whose metal shutters had been pulled down and hadn't opened again in 10 years. Phoebe was in the art room when she heard the doorbell. She stepped into the hallway and saw a man she had never met standing at the reception desk. He was middle-aged, large, with a burn scar stretching from his left cheekbone down to his chin, wearing a black coat and holding a thick white envelope. He asked the receptionist for Phoebe Aldrin, and when Phoebe stepped forward, he simply held out the envelope, without shaking her hand, without introducing himself. For the art program, he said, his voice deep and clipped, as if every word cost money. Phoebe opened the envelope right there at the desk. Inside was a check for $50,000, and a small handwritten note in black ink, the handwriting straight and sharp. For the girl who paints in yellow. Phoebe looked at the check, looked back at the note, looked at the man. Who sent this? Someone who noticed, Buck Tanner answered. Then he turned, walked out the door, got into the SUV, and the black vehicle quietly left the street, as if it had never appeared there at all. Phoebe stood in the middle of the hallway holding the check with both hands, and for the first time in her life, she didn't know whether she should cry from relief or tremble from fear. $50,000. That amount was more than her total income from the past 3 years combined. Who could write a check that large just because he had heard a 5-minute story on a balcony? That same morning, on the north side of the city, more than 20 miles from the community center, Garrett Kessler sat in the office behind his restaurant on Michigan Avenue. The restaurant was called Embers, one of 7 upscale restaurants belonging to the legal public face of the Kessler Syndicate. The front dining room served Wagyu beef and French wine to guests willing to pay $200 for dinner. The back room, where Garrett sat, served an entirely different kind of transaction. The room was paneled in oak, lit by a golden desk lamp. The smell of old whiskey soaked into the walls. Garrett sat behind the desk, his suit jacket open, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal a barbed wire tattoo running down his left forearm. Across from him sat a middle-aged man in a gray suit, sweat beading on his forehead even though the air conditioner was on. Garrett said nothing. He only pushed a thick stack of papers, about 24 pages, across the desk, hard-bound, with a notarized stamp in the upper right corner. The man across from him looked down at the papers, and his face shifted from anxious to bloodless. It was the contract he had signed 3 years earlier when he first joined the organization. The contract he had thought was merely a formality at the time. But now, looking again at every clause, he understood that every asset in his name, the house, the car, the bank accounts, all of it belonged to a company Garrett Kessler fully owned. "You can walk out of here with your name," Garrett said, his voice low and calm, as if he were reading the menu for an ordinary dinner. "Or without it. Your choice." The man opened his mouth, about to say something, but he looked into Garrett's eyes and changed his mind. He stood, lowered his head, and left without another word. The oak door closed. Garrett sat still, looking at the empty chair across from him. Then his eyes drifted to the corner of the desk, where an old leather notebook lay motionless, its cover worn at the edges, its spine cracked, though the pages inside remained intact. He didn't open the notebook. He only looked at it for a while, then turned back to the laptop screen. But $50,000 did not move through a financial system without leaving a trace, especially when it came from an account people knew belonged to a certain person. And Neil Pemberton, chairman of the Lakewood Foundation, was the kind of man who always knew where money went, because tracking money was exactly how he lived. Neil did not run Lakewood out of kindness. He ran it because 70% of the charitable fund flowed back into companies he anonymously owned under the categories of management fees and operating costs. Lakewood Foundation was the cleanest face in Neil Pemberton's dirty empire, and he protected it with lawyers, political connections, and a vigilance that never slept. When his financial advisor reported that $50,000 from an account linked to the Kessler Syndicate had just been transferred to a community center Lakewood was considering funding, Neil wasn't shocked. He was angry. Not because an underground organization was donating to children, but because Garrett Kessler, the man Neil considered the greatest threat to his real estate empire on the south side of Chicago, had just put one foot into the charitable territory Neil had carefully built as a cover. Neil picked up the phone and called Margot. His voice was calm to the point of coldness. "That art teacher at the community center, the one you brought to the Drake. I need you to keep an eye on her. Who she talks to, who comes to see her, everything." Margot was silent for 1 second on the other end. "She's just a teacher, Dad." "Nobody is just anything, Margot. Remember that." 1 week after the anonymous check, Garrett Kessler appeared at Southside Community Arts Center, and this time he didn't send anyone else in his place. Phoebe was washing paintbrushes in the sink at the back of the room when she heard leather shoes on the plastic floor, a sound that didn't belong here. She turned around and saw Garrett standing at the doorway of the art room, gray suit, hands in his trouser pockets, looking inside like a man standing at the door of a church and not quite sure whether he was allowed to step in. "I'd like to help," he said. Just that. No further explanation. Phoebe looked at him for a while. She wasn't stupid. She knew the check for $50,000 and the man named Garrett on the balcony of the Drake were connected, even if she wasn't sure how. But she also knew the center needed every bit of help it could get. And if this man wanted to volunteer, she would let him prove himself. "You can start by carrying those paint trays," Phoebe said, pointing to the stack of dirty paint trays piled in the corner of the room. "And you stay where I can see you." Garrett nodded, didn't argue, and took off his suit jacket, hanging it over the back of a chair. The first week, the children were afraid of him. That wasn't hard to understand. Garrett Kessler was over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, cold-faced, and when he sat in the plastic chair at the back of the art room, silently watching, he looked like a boulder someone had mistakenly placed in the middle of a flower garden. The children glanced at him, then quickly looked away, drew faster, spoke more softly, as if his presence had lowered the temperature of the room by several degrees. Phoebe noticed, but she didn't interfere. She knew trust in this place couldn't be forced. It had to come on its own. And if Garrett didn't have enough patience to wait, he didn't deserve to stay. Garrett waited. He sat in the back chair every afternoon, saying nothing unless asked, washing paintbrushes when Phoebe told him to, stacking chairs after the children went home, and never stepping close to any child when Phoebe wasn't in the room. The one who broke that wall of silence was Josie. One afternoon, When class had been over for 10 minutes, and the art room held only Phoebe cleaning up and Garrett stacking the paint trays, Josie came back. The little girl stood about 2 steps away from Garrett, holding a sheet of paper in both hands, looking up at him with wide, unblinking eyes. Then she held the picture out toward Garrett, as if presenting it before the strictest judging panel in the world. It was the yellow sun drawing. Garrett looked down at the picture, looked at the slightly crooked, slightly smudged sun, colored with a broken crayon on white paper yellowed at the corners. He was silent. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Josie began to draw her hand back. "That's a good sun," Garrett said. His voice was deep, a little rough, as if that sentence had to pass through a thick layer of rust before it could come out. But it was real, and Josie knew it was real, in the way children always know, by instinct, not reason. She smiled. A small smile, a little shy, but clear and true. Phoebe stood by the sink, paintbrush in hand, seeing the whole moment, and she felt something shift, not loudly, not dramatically, just something very small and very important falling into place. In the days after that, Garrett didn't come alone. Sometimes, a man named Brennan Holt stopped by the center at lunchtime, bringing large bags of food from Embers. Brennan was tall and lean, around 40, with a tattoo on his neck, and the eyes of someone who had seen the inside of prison walls longer than he wanted to remember. But when he laid the lunchboxes on the table for the children, his hands were gentle and careful, and he always greeted Phoebe with an old-fashioned, polite nod she rarely saw in this neighborhood. What Phoebe noticed was the way Brennan looked at Garrett, not the look of a friend, not the look of a coworker. It was the look of someone used to receiving orders, discreet, quick, and absolutely obedient. A glimpse of another world slipped into the colorful art room, then dissolved when Brennan left. Outside in the center's yard, Buck Tanner leaned against the black SUV, hands in his coat pockets, his eyes slowly sweeping from one end of the street to the other, then back again, as if he were reading a book only he could see. Josie ran into the yard during break, saw Buck, stopped, looked at him for 1 second, then lifted her hand and waved. Buck looked at the little girl, and something passed across his scarred face, not quite a smile, but close to one. He raised his hand and waved back. Then Josie ran off, and Buck went back to scanning the street. One afternoon, Garrett was helping clean the tables after class. His shirt sleeves rolled nearly to his elbows, and the barbed wire tattoo showed beneath the fluorescent lights. A boy in the group, stacking chairs nearby, saw it, stopped, and tilted his head. "What's that?" the boy asked, pointing at the tattoo. Garrett looked down at his forearm, then looked at the boy. "A reminder," he said. The boy waited for more, but Garrett said nothing else, only returned to stacking chairs. And the boy accepted that answer, the way children often accept things, immediately and without questioning. Phoebe stood at the art room door, watching Garrett stack the plastic chairs neatly into one corner, sleeves rolled high, tattoo showing, and she realized that for the first time since she had met him on the balcony of the Drake, he didn't look like the man in the perfect suit at the party, and he didn't look like the black shadow sitting in the SUV parked outside. He looked like a person trying to learn how to exist in an ordinary place, and not knowing whether he belonged there or not. Real conversations between the two of them never happened when there was a crowd. They happened in empty rooms, after everyone had gone home, when the paint of social politeness peeled away, and only the real voice remained. The art room at Southside Community Arts Center at 6 o'clock in the evening was such a place. The children had left long ago. The center director had locked his office door. The hallway was so quiet they could hear the fluorescent lights buzzing on the ceiling. Phoebe sat on the art room floor, her back against the wall, her legs stretched out among the dried paint marks that had clung to the tiles for years. Around her, the children's paintings hung from clotheslines across the room, swaying gently in the draft from the old ceiling fan. Garrett sat about an arm's length away from her, his back against the leg of a table, his knees bent, his hands resting on them. He had taken off his suit jacket long ago. White shirt with the sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. He looked less like a man who held half of South Chicago in his hands, and more like an ordinary person tired after a long day. They said nothing for a few minutes. The silence between them had changed over the past weeks, from the unfamiliar silence of two strangers into the comfortable silence of two people who had begun to realize they didn't need to fill every empty space with words. Garrett was the first to speak, and what he said wasn't what Phoebe had expected. "My grandfather raised me," he said, his voice low, his eyes on Josie's yellow sun painting hanging right in front of him, from when I was 11. My parents were gone by then. My old man first, then my mother 2 years later. She got sick, couldn't fight it. He stopped, as if weighing how far he would go. My grandfather was not a gentle man, but he was the only one who stayed. He taught me to read, not just books, people, rooms, situations. He used to tell me that anyone could destroy a room, but it took a real man to build something that people would want to keep. Garrett didn't say who his grandfather was, didn't say his name, didn't talk about the empire, the organization, or what the old man had left behind. He told it as if he were talking about an ordinary old man who had died and whom he still remembered every day. And Phoebe understood that this was how Garrett remembered him, not by what he had built, but by what he had said. The art room fell silent again. The ceiling fan turned. Paper rustled softly on the clotheslines. Phoebe looked down at her hands, at the blue and yellow paint dried on her fingers. Then she spoke, softer than a breath. I went through 7 homes before I turned 18. Garrett said nothing. He didn't nod, didn't ask. He only stayed silent in the way Phoebe needed, in the way no one had ever stayed silent for her before. A silence that said, I'm listening, and I'm not going anywhere. Most of them were fine, Phoebe continued. Not good, but fine. You learn to be invisible. You learn to not take up space. You learn to say thank you for everything, even when there's nothing to be thankful for. She stopped. Then, with a gentle motion, she pulled the collar of her sweater aside, revealing her left shoulder. A long, pale scar ran from her shoulder bone down near her shoulder blade, clear beneath the fluorescent light. The scar was old, the skin closed, but it was still there, and would always be there. One of them left this, Phoebe said. Just that. She didn't say who, didn't say with what, didn't say when. Only one short sentence and one scar, and Garrett understood that this was all she was ready to show him, and that it was already more than she had ever shown anyone. Garrett looked at the scar. His eyes didn't widen in shock, didn't narrow with pity. He looked at it with the eyes of someone who had seen wounds before, on other people's bodies and on his own, and knew that no words were enough, and that any words would be wrong. He didn't say, I'm sorry. Didn't say, that shouldn't have happened to you. Didn't say any of the things luckier people usually said when they saw proof of pain they had never had to endure. He only reached out, slowly, and touched the edge of the scar lightly with the tip of his finger. Just 1 second. Then he drew his hand back. That moment wasn't a kiss, wasn't a confession, wasn't a promise. It was something older and truer than all of those things. 2 wounded people recognizing each other's wounds and not turning away. Phoebe pulled her collar back into place. Garrett set his hand back on his knee. They sat in silence for a while longer, and the small art room with the children's paintings hanging on clotheslines suddenly became the safest place either of them had ever known. Out in the hallway, Margot Pemberton stood beside the narrow crack of the door, her phone in her hand, the screen glowing blue beneath the dim light. She had been standing there long enough, had seen enough. Margot turned away, walked softly down the hallway to the back door, and when she reached the parking lot, she pressed call on the only number marked as priority in her contacts. Neil Pemberton's voice answered on the second ring. They're getting close, Dad, Margot said, her voice low. Closer than you'd want. The invitation came from Neil Pemberton himself, and it arrived the way invitations from powerful people always arrived, less like a question than a privilege you weren't allowed to refuse. Margot called Phoebe on a Tuesday evening, her voice excited, saying that her father had heard about the art program, that he was very impressed, and that he wanted to invite Phoebe to display the children's paintings at Lakewood Foundation's annual charity gala at the Palmer House Hotel. Not just display them. Neil wanted Phoebe to go up on stage and tell her story, the story of the center, of the children. He thinks you'd be perfect, Phoebe, Margot said. The audience needs to see someone real, someone who actually does the work, not just writes checks. Phoebe sat on the floor of her studio, Pepper curled in her lap, the phone tucked between her shoulder and ear, and she felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel. Hope. Not vague hope, but specific hope, with a date, a time, and a place. This could be the chance to save the program. If the major donors at the gala saw the children's paintings, heard the story about Josie, about the yellow sun, maybe they would open their wallets. Maybe the center wouldn't have to close. Phoebe spent the entire next week preparing. She chose the 12 best paintings from the art room, each one made by a different child, and framed them with recycled wood she picked up from the salvage yard, 4 streets away from the center. She borrowed the old security guard's handsaw, cut each strip of wood, sanded them with sandpaper until her hands blistered, then assembled the frames with glue and small nails. Each frame was a little rough, a little crooked, but each frame held inside it a painting into which a child had placed their whole heart. To Phoebe, those 12 paintings weren't decorations for the gala. They were proof. Proof that in the poorest neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, among shuttered storefronts and empty lots grown wild with weeds, there were children who knew how to create beauty if someone placed a brush in their hands. What Phoebe didn't know, and had no way of knowing, was that Neil Pemberton had not invited her because he was moved. He invited her because she was a perfect story. A poor teacher, raised in foster homes, teaching children from the slums to paint with love and broken crayons. That was the kind of story that made wealthy donors feel warm inside when they signed checks. And more importantly, it was the kind of story that made the press take pictures of Neil Pemberton standing beside Phoebe, with a compassionate smile, adding another glossy coat to the charitable front he had worked so hard to build. Neil did not yet plan to humiliate Phoebe. Not at this point. He only wanted to use her, the way he used everyone, as a tool to serve his image. The night before the gala, Garrett asked to meet Phoebe at the center. He arrived later than usual, when all the lights in the art room had been turned off, and only the glow from the hallway lamp spilled through the glass door. Phoebe was finishing the last frame when she heard his familiar footsteps. She looked up and knew at once that something was different. Garrett stood in the doorway, his suit still perfect, his hands still in his pockets, but his face no longer carried the controlled calm she was used to. His jaw was tight, his eyes were darker. He looked like a man weighing every word before speaking, because every word could change everything. "Phoebe," he said, "there's something I need to tell you." He stepped into the room and stopped a few paces from her. He opened his mouth, and the phone in his suit pocket vibrated. Garrett looked at the screen. His face changed in a fraction of a second, from the man trying to tell the truth back into the man half the city feared. He answered, listened to Buck say a few short sentences, then hung up. "Tomorrow," Garrett said, looking at Phoebe with eyes she couldn't read. "I'll tell you tomorrow. I promise." Then he walked out the door faster than he had walked in, and the sound of his leather shoes echoed down the hallway before disappearing beneath the hard slam of the back door. Phoebe stood alone in the dark art room, still holding the unfinished wooden frame, and felt a familiar ache, the feeling of someone who had been left behind too many times not to recognize the sound of footsteps moving away. She set the frame down, looked at the 12 finished paintings leaning against the wall, and told herself tomorrow would be fine. Tomorrow would be fine. But deep in her chest, in the place she had learned not to listen to a long time ago, something was trembling very softly, like a warning bell she didn't yet know how to understand. She arrived at the gala the next day, completely unaware of who Garrett Kessler truly was. She had no idea where the $50,000 had come from, or that Neil Pemberton already knew everything. Little did she know, the door she was about to walk through would never let her come back whole. The Palmer House Hotel on the night of the Lakewood Foundation Gala looked like a small palace built only to remind everyone who entered that they belonged to the highest class of the city, and to remind people like Phoebe Aldrin that she did not belong here. Phoebe stood outside the glass doors of the grand lobby at 7 o'clock in the evening. The 12 paintings had been brought in that afternoon by Lakewood's logistics staff, and all she had left to do was step through those doors and do one thing: tell 300 strangers about the children she loved. One thing. But when she looked through the glass doors and saw the crystal chandeliers catching the light like 1,000 frozen raindrops, saw the tables covered in spotless white cloths, saw 300 people moving among champagne glasses and polished laughter, she felt her worn canvas shoes grow heavier than ever. She drew in a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. Sound rushed at her like a wall. Soft jazz from the band in the corner, glasses touching, laughter mingling with conversation. Phoebe walked straight to the exhibition area on the west side of the ballroom, where the children's 12 paintings had been hung on wooden stands arranged by Lakewood's staff. She stood in front of each picture and adjusted the frames so they sat straight, even though they were already straight, only because she needed an excuse to stay still in one corner where no one would ask what she was doing there. She stopped longest in front of Josie's yellow sun. Neil Pemberton came to find her at 7:30. He wore a black suit, a Lakewood pin on his lapel, a warm, open smile, and he shook Phoebe's hand with just enough firmness to send the message that you matter to me. He led her around and introduced her to 3 major donors, and each time he introduced her, he used the same opening line, saying that Phoebe Aldrin was living proof of what Lakewood Foundation stood for, that she was the rough gem the foundation was proud to have found. Phoebe smiled and shook hands, and tried not to think about the fact that she was being introduced more like an exhibit than a human being. Everything went according to plan. Until 8:15, right before Phoebe was invited onto the stage, a man in a gray suit hurried to Neil's side, leaned close to his ear, and whispered a few short sentences. Phoebe stood 3 steps away, and she couldn't hear the words, but she saw what only someone who had grown up watching adults' faces in order to predict danger could see. Neil's face changed. Not much. Only half a second. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed. Then all of it vanished beneath his familiar smile so quickly, it was almost as if it had never happened. But when Neil turned back to look at Phoebe, his eyes were different. No longer the gaze of a benefactor looking at the rough gem he had discovered. It was the gaze of someone who had just realized that rough gem belonged to his enemy. Neil Pemberton had just received final confirmation from his financial advisor. The $50,000 donation traced directly back to an account linked to Garrett Kessler. And in that moment, standing in the middle of the Palmer House ballroom with 300 donors and soft jazz playing around him, Neil Pemberton rewrote the entire script for the night. He didn't need time to think. Men like Neil didn't need time. They reacted by instinct. And Neil's instinct was to destroy any threat before it could take root. Phoebe stepped onto the stage at 8:30. The spotlight shining on her was warm and bright. So bright she couldn't clearly see a single face below, only blurred shadows and light reflecting off wine glasses. She told them about the center, about the art room, about the children who used broken crayons to create worlds. 300 people applauded politely. Then Neil stepped onto the stage, microphone in hand, his smile still perfect. He began asking questions, gently, naturally, about the program, about the children. Then, with the skill of a seasoned lawyer, he steered the questions toward the personal, toward Phoebe's childhood, toward the reason she understood disadvantaged children. And Phoebe, because she was honest to the point of foolishness and brave to the point of danger, told the truth. The rest, you already heard at the beginning of the story. But there is one thing you haven't heard. Garrett Kessler arrived at the Palmer House late, deliberately. He didn't use the main entrance, but came through the service door behind the kitchen, where 2 restaurant employees recognized him and immediately stepped aside without a word. He stood at the back of the ballroom. In the darkness the spotlight could not touch, his hands in his suit pockets, his back against a marble column. He saw Phoebe on the stage, saw Neil standing beside her with the microphone, saw the way Neil guided the questions like a chess player moving an opponent's piece into a trap. And when the room sank into a kind of silence, Garrett recognized immediately, because he had lived his whole life among powerful people and knew exactly what that silence meant. He understood everything. It was not the silence of sympathy. It was the silence of 300 people looking down. Garrett saw Phoebe step down from the stage, saw her hands shaking, saw her walk straight to the door without looking back, her canvas shoes out of place on the marble floor. And he felt something he had not felt in many years, an anger that was not hot but cold, the kind of anger that did not burst into flame, but froze into ice, hard and sharp and patient. Garrett stepped out through the back door of the Palmer House and stood in the rain, not caring that his $5,000 suit was soaking through. He pulled out his phone and called Buck. "Where did she go?" he asked, his voice so calm that Buck, who had followed Garrett for 20 years, recognized at once that this was the most dangerous kind of calm. Phoebe didn't call a taxi, didn't call anyone. She stepped out through the back door of the Palmer House, into the November rain of Chicago. Edna's borrowed black dress soaked through in less than a minute, her hair plastered to her face, and her waterlogged canvas shoes making wet footsteps on the sidewalk that she didn't bother to hear. She walked. 12 streets, the same 12 streets she rode her bicycle across every morning to get to the center. But tonight, they felt 1,000 times longer, and every street was empty in the way only the streets of South Chicago could be empty on a rainy night. Not empty of people, but empty of hope. She didn't think. She only walked. Her feet knew the way back to the only place where she belonged, without needing her mind to give orders. Southside Community Arts Center appeared through the rain like a familiar shadow, its front dark, its iron shutters pulled down, but Phoebe had the key. She opened the back door, stepped into the dark hallway that smelled of bleach, and went straight to the art room at the end of the hall. She didn't turn on the lights. The glow from the streetlight outside the window was just enough for her to see the children's paintings still hanging from the clotheslines, swaying softly in the dark, like small flags from a kingdom no one knew about except her. Phoebe sat down in front of the easel. Her hand reached for a brush without needing to look. By instinct, by habit, the way the body always knows what to do when the mind has stopped working. She dipped the brush into the jar of black paint, then the red, and she painted. Not flowers, not suns, not the things she taught the children to paint every day. She painted with the anger she had swallowed for 27 years. The anger for the 7 families that had returned her like a defective object. The anger for the room of 300 people who had looked at her as if she were a stain. The anger for herself for being foolish enough to believe that this time would be different. Long, forceful strokes. Black paint over red, red over black. The painting had no shape, no name, only pure fury spreading across white canvas. She didn't cry. She painted. Because Phoebe Aldrin had learned a very long time ago that tears didn't change anything, but paint could. Paint stayed. Paint didn't disappear when you wiped at it. Paint was proof that you had felt something and were still alive to feel it. She didn't know how much time had passed when the knock came at the door. Not a hurried knock, not pounding. 2 soft, firm knocks, then silence, then waiting. Phoebe set the brush down. Her hands were stained black and red all the way to the wrists, looking like the hands of someone who had just dug through something buried for a very long time. She walked to the door and opened it. Garrett stood there. His suit was soaked through from the rain, his black hair pressed flat to his forehead, but his posture was still straight, still controlled, still Garrett Kessler. Only his eyes were different. Those eyes were no longer cold. She didn't ask how he knew she was here. She didn't ask why he had come. She only stood in the doorway, hair wet, dress wet, hands stained with paint, and looked at him with red eyes that held no tears. Garrett didn't step inside. He stood at the threshold, looking over her shoulder into the dark art room, looking at the painting on the easel. Black and red. No flowers, no sun, no light, only the storm. He looked at her hands, looked at her eyes, and he didn't say what most people would have said. He didn't say, "Are you okay?" Didn't say, "It's going to be fine." Didn't say any of the kind lies people use to make someone in pain stay quiet so they can feel less uncomfortable. "Good," Garrett said, his voice deep, his eyes still on the painting. "You should be angry. Use it." Phoebe felt something inside her that she hadn't expected. Not relief, not comfort, but the feeling of being seen. Someone had looked at her anger and hadn't told her to stop. Someone had looked at the black and red painting and hadn't called it ugly. Someone understood that sometimes destruction was also a way of building. She looked at him, and the question she had been holding in her chest for weeks finally broke free. Soft but impossible to take back. "Who are you, Garrett? Really?" Garrett didn't avoid it, didn't turn his face away, didn't give a dismissive smile. He looked straight into her eyes, and for the first time since they had met on the balcony of the Drake, he told the truth, without wrapping it in any disguise. He said his full name, said enough for her to understand. Kessler Syndicate. The restaurants were a cover. The $50,000 was his money, and the man with the burn scar who had brought the envelope to the center was his right hand. Phoebe stepped back. Only one step, but enough for Garrett to notice, and enough for her to know that her feet were speaking for the frightened part of her that her mouth couldn't express. But she didn't run. She stood there, hands stained with paint, dress soaked, looking at the man half the city feared, and she didn't run. "I'm not going to pretend I'm a good man," Garrett said, his voice lower, closer, as if he were saying this more to himself than to her. "But what they did in there tonight, that's a kind of cruelty I don't have the stomach for." Garrett left the community center close to midnight, leaving Phoebe alone in the dark art room with the black and red painting and the truth he had just placed on the table between them. He didn't promise he would come back, didn't promise he would fix anything, didn't kiss her, didn't hold her, didn't say any words that sounded like something from a movie. He only nodded, stepped out into the rain, and disappeared into the black SUV waiting at the end of the street, where Buck sat behind the wheel with the patience of a man used to waiting in the dark. When Garrett returned to the penthouse on the top floor of the building he owned in North Loop, he didn't sleep. He sat down at the desk in his private study, opened the top left drawer, and took out the old leather notebook. The cover was worn at the corners, the spine cracked, the smell of leather faded long ago but still lingering at the edges of the pages. He turned to the page he had read so many times that the handwritten ink had faded beneath his fingerprints, and read again the sharp slanted line written by his grandfather. Never strike in anger. Strike when they think you've forgotten. Garrett closed the notebook, placed it on the desk, and waited. The next morning, Buck arrived at the penthouse at 6 o'clock, carrying coffee and the question he knew Garrett had been waiting for. "What's the play?" Garrett sat by the window, looking down at Chicago waking beneath a thin layer of fog after last night's rain. He didn't turn around when he answered. "Not yet. If Pemberton's lawyers find one text, one call, one anything between me and her right now, they'll spin it. They'll say I funded the center to launder money through her. They'll make her the accomplice instead of the victim. We go dark." "How dark?" Buck asked. "No contact. Not with her, not with the center, not with anyone connected to her. Zero." Buck nodded. He didn't ask anything more. 20 years following, Garrett had taught him that when Garrett said not yet, it didn't mean no. It meant he was counting down. Garrett called Tate Corbin, the organization's financial advisor, a gray-haired man in a gray suit with the face of a bank executive and the mind of a man who buried secrets for a living. "Lakewood Foundation," Garrett said. "I want every transaction, every shell company, every dollar that went in and didn't come back out the way it was supposed to. Take your time. Be thorough. I want it airtight." Tate didn't ask why. He only asked, "How far back?" "As far as it goes." Buck received another assignment, to track Neil Pemberton's schedule. Not too close, not too far, just enough to know where he went, whom he met, what he said, and most importantly, what he was planning next. And Phoebe Aldrin woke the next morning in the third-floor studio, alone, Pepper curled at the foot of the bed, and realized Garrett hadn't called. No message. Nothing. She wasn't surprised. She was used to being left behind. But this time it hurt more, because this time she had begun to believe. She pushed the thought aside, put on jeans and an old sweater, and rode her bicycle to the center. Day 1. The art room was emptier than usual. 2 chairs in the middle row were empty. Phoebe counted heads and realized 2 children were missing. Tommy and Lena, the twins whose mother always picked them up on time every afternoon. She asked the center director. He hesitated, then said the children's mother had called that morning and said she had heard rumors about a problematic funding source for the center, and she didn't want her children involved in anything complicated. Phoebe stood in the hallway, looking at the 2 empty chairs through the glass door of the art room, and felt each empty chair weigh more than any insult from the gala night. Josie still came. She sat in her usual place, at the corner of the last table, head bent as she drew. She didn't ask why the class had fewer children, didn't ask why her teacher had dark circles under her eyes. She only drew. Day 2. Everything got worse. A white envelope from Lakewood Foundation was lying on the center director's desk when Phoebe arrived. An official letter, on letterhead, with cold legal language, announcing that Lakewood Foundation was terminating its funding for Southside Community Arts Center effective immediately, citing the need to reevaluate the financial transparency of partner organizations receiving support. The center director called Phoebe into his office, closed the door, and spoke in the voice of someone who had tried his best, but knew that his best was still not enough. The free art program would close at the end of the week. Phoebe asked for more time. He shook his head, not because he didn't want to, because there was no money left to do anything with. Phoebe stepped out of the office, walked down the hallway, went through the front door, and sat on the cracked cement steps outside the center. 10 o'clock in the morning, weak sunlight, the traffic from the main street drifting back like a ringing in her ears. She took out her phone, opened her email, and began to write. Not to Garrett, not waiting for someone to come save her. Phoebe Aldrin had lived 27 years without anyone coming to save her, and she didn't plan to start depending on that now. She wrote 5 emails to 5 small charities she found online, each email briefly telling them about the program, about the children, about the danger of closing, asking for emergency funding. She reread each email twice, corrected the spelling, then pressed send. Then she sat on the steps, holding her phone, and waited. Over the next 24 hours, all 5 organizations replied. All 5 refused. 2 of them gave no reason. The other 3 used different polite phrases to say the same thing. They had heard about the issue at Southside Community Arts Center, and at this time, they weren't in a position to provide support. Rumors spread faster than paint could dry, and Phoebe, sitting alone on the steps of the community center with 5 refusals in her inbox, realized Neil Pemberton hadn't only humiliated her on stage, he was erasing her from the map. On the morning of the 3rd day, Phoebe woke before the alarm rang and did something she had never done before. She took out her phone, opened the camera, set it on the easel in her studio facing the window where early light was slipping in, and pressed record. She didn't put on makeup, didn't prepare a script, didn't perform. She only sat in front of the camera, in her old sweater, her hair tied up in a hurry, and spoke. She spoke about Southside Community Arts Center, about the art room at the end of the hallway, with paintings hanging from clotheslines, about children using broken crayons to create worlds on blank sheets of paper, about the program that was about to be shut down at the end of the week, and how no one would listen when she tried to explain why. She didn't mention Garrett's name, didn't mention Neil's name, didn't mention the gala night, didn't mention dirty money, didn't mention anything except the children. Because to Phoebe, the children were the only thing that mattered, and if the world out there didn't want to hear about anything else, then at least let it hear about them. She posted the video on social media at 7 o'clock in the morning, then rode her bicycle to the center without checking it again. By noon, the video had 3,000 views. By afternoon, 4,000, a few dozen comments, most of them hearts, and the words "stay strong," the kind of warm support that didn't turn into rent for the art room or money for paint. Not enough. Not nearly enough. But Phoebe hadn't recorded the video to be saved. She recorded it because she didn't know what else to do except keep fighting with the only weapons she had, her own voice and the truth. At noon, Phoebe's phone vibrated. An email from Margot Pemberton. No message. Only 3 screenshots. Phoebe opened them and saw a group chat belonging to Chicago's upper circle. Names she didn't recognize, but faces she remembered from the gala night. They were talking about her. One person wrote that the foster care story was probably something she had made up for pity. Another said she was nothing more than Kessler's latest prey. A third posted a screenshot of Phoebe on the gala stage with a laughing until crying emoji. Phoebe finished reading, set the phone down on the table, and looked out the art room window, where the children were eating lunch in the yard. She didn't know whether Margot had sent it out of cruelty, or because some part of Margot Pemberton felt guilty and wanted to warn her. She didn't care. She only knew she needed to send this to someone, not to ask for help, but because if she kept it alone, it would eat her from the inside. Phoebe picked up her phone, took screenshots of the 3 images, and sent them to the only number she had from Garrett's world, Buck Tanner's number. She added no message, didn't write help, didn't write anything at all, just the 3 images. Buck received them at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. He forwarded them to Garrett at 1:10. Garrett opened the images and looked at each one, his face unchanged, but his left hand tightened on the arm of the chair until his knuckles went white. He didn't call Phoebe. He didn't send a message. He opened his laptop, found the video Phoebe had posted that morning, watched it from beginning to end, and listened to her voice telling the story of the children, the art room, the program about to close. Then he sent the video link to Tate Corbin with one single message. This is the story. Learn it. Tate watched the video 3 times. Then he began preparing questions. The 3rd day, the final class. Phoebe opened the art room door at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and counted heads. 7 children. Last week there had been 15. She didn't tell the children this was the last class. She said nothing except the things she always said. What we would draw today. Take out your crayons. There's no wrong color. Josie sat in her usual spot, at the corner of the last table, head bent over her paper as she drew. She didn't ask why the class was emptier. Didn't ask why her teacher spoke less than usual. Josie only drew. When the lesson was almost over, Josie stood up, holding a sheet of paper in both hands, and walked to Phoebe. The little girl held the picture out without saying a word. Phoebe looked down. On the paper, Josie had drawn a person with long brown hair holding a brush, standing in front of an easel, and beside that person was a large yellow sun taking up almost half the page. The person was Phoebe. The sun was Josie's son. Phoebe held the picture with both hands, and she felt something inside her chest break open. Not loudly, not dramatically, only like the final thread that had held everything together for the past 3 days had snapped cleanly. She turned her face away, stepped out through the art room door, stood in the hallway, and cried. Not in front of the people who wanted to see her collapse, but in a safe place, where Josie couldn't see, where the children couldn't see, because Phoebe Aldrin could allow herself to break, but she would never let the children she loved watch her break. That afternoon, on local television and news sites, Neil Pemberton stood behind a podium in the lobby of Chicago City Hall, the Lakewood pin on his lapel, his smile confident, and announced that Lakewood Foundation had decided to cut ties with recipient organizations whose funding sources lacked clarity in order to protect the foundation's integrity and transparency. He didn't mention Phoebe's name, didn't mention the center's name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. And on the north side of the city, in the office behind Ember's restaurant, Garrett Kessler sat watching the news, looked at Neil Pemberton's face on the screen, then turned off the TV. He turned to Buck. "What time is the press conference tomorrow?" 2:00, Buck answered. "City Hall." Garrett nodded. "Get my gray suit ready." At 2:00 the next afternoon, the grand lobby on the first floor of Chicago City Hall was packed. The press filled all 4 rows of seats at the front. Cameras stood on tripods, flashes ready, microphones bearing radio and television station flags lined up across the podium. Behind them sat several dozen local officials and representatives from charitable organizations, backs straight, faces polite, glossy printed programs in hand. Neil Pemberton stood at the podium, black suit, Lakewood pin on his lapel, his warm baritone voice carrying through the speaker system and echoing across the marble lobby. He was speaking about transparency responsibility, about ethical commitment in charitable work, about the mission of protecting public trust. Round, polished phrases, sliding past the ear like water over glass, leaving behind nothing except the impression that the man speaking was a respectable human being. No one in the room questioned that. No one noticed that in the second press row from the front, Buck Tanner was sitting with a freelance photographer badge, a camera hanging around his neck, his face expressionless, his eyes not on the podium but slowly scanning every exit in the lobby. 3 rows away, Tate Corbin sat between 2 real reporters, a notebook open on his lap, pen ready in his hand, wearing the face of a seasoned financial journalist, taking careful notes. And at the rear door of the lobby, Brennan Holt leaned against the wall, hands in his coat pockets, blending in among the building security staff without anyone looking twice. They didn't arrive together. They came separately, at different times, through different doors. They had been there before Neil Pemberton stepped up to the podium, like chess pieces already placed on the board while the opposing player didn't yet know the game had begun. Neil was in the middle of a sentence about new standards for grant recipient partners when the main doors of the lobby opened. Not slowly, not cautiously. The heavy oak doors, weighing hundreds of pounds, swung open with one clean, firm push from outside, and afternoon light flooded the lobby like a streak of white paint cutting across a dark canvas. Garrett Kessler stepped over the threshold, alone. Light gray suit, white shirt, no tie, his right hand holding a dark brown leather document case. No one followed him, no entourage, no line of bodyguards, no engine noise or display of power through numbers. Just one man walking through the door with the absolute confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly what would happen next. He moved down the center aisle between the 2 rows of seats, his footsteps ringing across the marble floor, his eyes fixed straight on the podium, and he passed each row as if he were walking through the dining room of his own restaurant and had only happened to arrive late for dinner. The press turned to look. Cameras swung after him. Whispers spread through the lobby like wind through a rice field. A few reporters recognized him, not by his face, but through the chain reaction. One person asking another. And the name Kessler traveled from the first row to the last in less than 10 seconds. Neil Pemberton saw Garrett when he was still about 10 steps from the podium. He stopped mid-sentence. Truly stopped, not pausing for breath, but stopping as if someone had pulled the plug. The smile on his face didn't disappear at once. It died slowly, shrinking at the corners of his mouth. And what replaced it wasn't fear but recognition. The recognition that the game he thought he controlled had just been overturned. "Who let you in?" Neil asked. His voice still amplified through the microphone, and the whole lobby clearly heard the tremor he hadn't managed to hide. Garrett didn't stop walking, didn't look to either side, didn't even slow down. "The front door was open," he said, his voice deep, calm, and not on a microphone at all, yet still clear enough in the echoing marble lobby. "This is City Hall. I'm a taxpayer." He stepped onto the podium, placed the leather document case on the table, right in front of Neil, gently but firmly, the sound of leather meeting wood ringing through the sudden, thick silence of the hall. "Open it," Garrett said. 2 words. No raised voice, no threat. Just 2 words, as if he were inviting someone to open a menu. Neil looked at the document case, looked at Garrett, looked at the press aiming every lens toward the podium. He knew that refusing to open it would kill him, and opening it would kill him too. But refusing to open it in front of the press would make him look like a man with something to hide, and Neil Pemberton had built his entire life on the image of a man with nothing to hide. He opened it. His fingers trembled slightly as he turned the first page. A copy of a real estate purchase contract between Lakewood Foundation and a shell company, priced 40% below market value, with the seller's signature belonging to a name Neil knew very well, because it was the name he hid behind 3 layers of subsidiary companies. The second page. An internal email from Neil's own account to Lakewood's chief accountant, instructing the transfer of funds into an operating costs category that was, in reality, payment to the shell company. The third page. A detailed financial statement compiled by Tate Corbin over the past 3 days, showing that 70% of Lakewood Foundation's charitable money over the past 5 years had flowed back into companies anonymously owned by Neil Pemberton, under the cover of management fees. Neil looked at the third page, and his face turned a color Garrett had seen many times in his life, the color of a man who realized he had lost before he had even understood he was playing. Garrett didn't look at Neil. He turned his back to the podium, faced the 4 rows of journalists, sitting in a silence so complete that the zooming of the cameras could be heard, and spoke in a calm voice, as if he were reading the opening hours of a restaurant. "I believe you have questions for Mr. Pemberton." 1 second of silence. Then Tate Corbin stood from the 5th row, his notebook open in his hand, his pen pointing at the page of notes he had prepared over the past 3 days. Tate's voice was calm, professional, without the slightest trace of emotion. The voice of someone used to reading numbers before a board of directors and knowing that numbers, by themselves, were already weapons. "Mr. Pemberton, records show that Lakewood Foundation signed contracts to purchase 4 commercial properties from Meridian Holdings LLC over the past 3 years, all of them below market value by 35 to 40%. Meridian Holdings LLC is registered in Delaware under a multi-layered ownership structure, and the final layer traces back to 1 individual. Can you confirm that individual is not you?" The question fell into the lobby like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spread at once. The real reporters, the ones who had come here to cover a boring charity event, suddenly straightened in their seats. Their noses had caught the scent of blood. A reporter from the Tribune raised a hand immediately after Tate. "Mr. Pemberton, the internal email in the file shows instructions to transfer funds into an operating costs category. Can you explain that expense?" Then another reporter. Then another. The questions came in like waves striking a seawall, each one carrying a number, a name, a specific date that Neil could not brush away with a smile or polished phrases. Flashbulbs went off again and again. Microphones pointed at him from every direction. Neil Pemberton stood on the very podium he had built, under the lights he had turned on, in front of the crowd he had summoned, and all of it now turned back to swallow him whole. His face went from white to red, then back to white again. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked toward his private attorney standing in the side wing of the lobby, and received a slow shake of the head. Neil turned back to the front, pointing a finger at Garrett, who stood in the center aisle, hands in his pockets, calm as a man watching a play whose ending he already knew. "You're going to listen to him?" Neil shouted, his voice losing control for the first time, cracking at the end like splintering glass. "This man is a criminal. He runs an organization that—" "Let's talk about people," Garrett interrupted, without raising his voice, without stepping forward, only standing still in the aisle and speaking loudly enough for his voice to carry through the marble lobby. He gestured lightly toward Buck, sitting in the 2nd row. That man served 2 tours in Iraq, came home with burns covering half his face and a stack of medical bills taller than his daughter. Nobody would hire him. I did. Then he nodded toward the back door, where Brennan stood leaning against the wall. That man went to prison at 22, got out at 30. Today he runs one of my restaurants. His 2 daughters are in college. He paid for it himself. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a defense. Just a few short, sharp sentences, falling into the lobby's silence like drops of ink falling into clear water. Garrett turned back to Neil, looked straight at him, and delivered his final sentence in that hall. "You asked who I am. I'm the man who hires the people your system throws away." Neil, still clinging to the podium like a man clinging to a plank in a storm, forced out his last question in a trembling voice. He no longer had the strength to hide. "Who are these people? People you should have noticed a long time ago." Garrett turned his back, walked down the center aisle between the 2 rows of seats, his footsteps ringing across the marble floor. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. Behind him, the press had turned every camera toward Neil Pemberton, and the rapid-fire questions exploded through the lobby like fireworks, each question carrying one piece of the empire Neil had worked so hard to build, and every piece was falling. While Garrett Kessler walked out of Chicago City Hall and Neil Pemberton sank into a sea of questions from the press, Phoebe Aldrin was standing in the empty art room at Southside Community Arts Center, taking the children's paintings down from the clotheslines. She didn't know what was happening on the north side of the city. She didn't watch the news. She didn't check her phone. She was only doing the things she knew had to be done when everything ended, cleaning up. Each painting was taken down carefully, folded gently, and placed into the cardboard box she had gotten from the grocery store at the head of the street. Every picture she lifted down weighed more than its real weight, because each one carried a child's name, an afternoon, an innocent question about color, and the quiet promise that tomorrow she would still be here, a promise she hadn't been able to keep. She had just lifted the 9th painting from the clothesline when she heard quick footsteps in the hallway, and the art room door flew open. Rosa Gutierrez stood in the doorway, 65 years old, small, silver hair pinned neatly up, wearing the old wool coat she wore every time she picked Josie up after class. Her hand was holding her phone, the screen still lit, and her eyes were red, but she was smiling. Not a polite smile or a forced smile. It was the smile of someone who had just received news they did not dare believe was true. She hurried across the art room, wrapped her arms around Phoebe from behind, held her tight with small hands that were astonishingly strong, and said in a voice breaking between laughter and tears, "I don't know what happened. I don't know who did what. But they're saying on the news that Lakewood is under investigation. And they're saying the center can stay open, Phoebe. They're saying it can stay open." Phoebe stood still in Rosa's arms, the 9th painting still in her hands, and she did not understand. She did not understand what Rosa was saying, did not understand what it meant for Lakewood to be under investigation. I did not understand why the center could stay open when 20 minutes earlier she had been folding paintings into a box. She only felt Rosa's hands warm against her back, and heard the sound of small footsteps running into the room. Josie stood at the door, looking at her grandmother hugging her teacher, looking at her grandmother smiling, looking at her teacher crying, and the little girl did not ask why. The 8-year-old knew nothing about Lakewood Foundation, Neil Pemberton, press conferences, numbers, contracts, or shell companies. She only saw her grandmother smiling and her teacher crying, and in Josie's world, that meant everything was going to be all right. Josie sat down on the art room floor, took the old box of crayons from her backpack, opened it, and began to draw. Rosa let go of Phoebe, wiped her eyes, then sat down on the plastic chair near the door, watching her granddaughter draw on the floor with a smile still glowing on her wrinkled face. Phoebe stood in the middle of the art room and looked around. She looked at the paintings already folded in the cardboard box, looked at Josie sitting on the floor, blending colors, looked at Rosa wiping away tears. Then her eyes stopped on the opposite wall, where the black and red painting she had made on the gala night was still hanging, not yet taken down. She hadn't taken it down. Among all the paintings she had removed and placed into the box, she had left that one there, not because she had forgotten, but because some part of her wasn't ready to put that anger away. Phoebe set the 9th painting on the table, walked to the easel, dipped the brush into the jar of yellow paint, the same jar she had bought with her own money 3 months earlier to teach Josie how to blend colors, and across the black and red painting, through the furious and chaotic brushstrokes, she pulled one single streak of yellow. Just one streak, cutting across the darkness, thin but bright, like sunlight slipping through a crack in a door inside a room that had been dark for a very long time. She stepped back, looked at the painting, and for the first time in 3 days, she breathed out. That evening, after Rosa had taken Josie home, after the center had locked its doors, after the streetlights began to come on along the road, a black SUV parked across the street. Garrett Kessler stepped out, alone, still wearing the same gray suit from the afternoon. He crossed the street and stood in front of the glass door of the art room. It was dark inside. The streetlight outside gave just enough light for him to see into the room. The plastic chairs stacked neatly, the cardboard box of paintings on the table, the empty clotheslines, and on the wall opposite the window, the black and red painting, with its new yellow streak, brighter than everything around it beneath the dim streetlight. Garrett stood looking at the painting through the glass door. He didn't knock, didn't try to open it, didn't take out his phone to call Phoebe. He only stood there, both hands in his trouser pockets, looking at the yellow streak against the black and red, and understood. She didn't need him to destroy Neil Pemberton. She didn't need him to save the center. She didn't need him to stand in the middle of City Hall and fight in her place. She only needed to know that someone had seen her, and the yellow streak on the painting, fragile and bright in the middle of the darkness, said she had found herself on her own. Garrett stood there for a little while longer, then he turned away, walked back toward the SUV, and drove into the Chicago night. The next day, Phoebe Aldrin did something no one expected, including herself. She rode her bicycle north through 15 streets she had never had any reason to ride through before, stopped in front of Embers on Michigan Avenue, and walked in. No appointment, no call to Buck, no warning to anyone. She stepped through the restaurant's heavy glass door in an old sweater and jeans streaked with paint, her hair tied up in a hurry, her canvas shoes worn at the heels. In the middle of noon, while the main dining room was still preparing for the evening shift, and the scent of oak mixed with cooking butter drifted out from the kitchen. The manager at the host stand looked her over from head to toe, and Phoebe had already prepared herself for the moment she would be asked to leave. But that moment never came. The manager looked at her for one more second, then nodded, stepped out from behind the stand, and said, "Follow me, please." He led her through the main dining room, past the oak door behind the bar, into a narrow hallway that ended at an office. Garrett had shown the staff her picture, had told them that if she came, they were to bring her in. He knew she would come. Phoebe didn't know whether that made her angrier or less angry. Garrett sat behind his desk, papers spread in front of him, a cold cup of coffee beside them, the window behind him throwing noon light into the room. He looked up when Phoebe walked in, and if he was surprised, nothing on his face showed it. He set down his pen, sat back, and waited. Phoebe didn't sit. She stood in the middle of the room, 3 steps from Garrett's desk, both hands at her sides, and she didn't thank him. She didn't smile. She didn't say, "Thank you for saving the center," or "I saw what you did at City Hall," or any sentence Garrett might have already prepared an answer for. She spoke in a voice that shook, not from fear, but because the anger she had been holding for 3 days had finally found a way out. "You disappeared for 3 days. 3 days, Garrett. You told me who you are. You told me the money was yours. You looked at me in that dark room and told me to use my anger. And then you vanished. No call, no text, nothing. You let me think I was completely alone. You let me sit on those steps and beg 5 strangers for money that never came. You let me pack up those paintings into a cardboard box, thinking it was over." Garrett said nothing, didn't move, only looked at her. "And then," Phoebe continued, her voice rising, sharper now, "you show up at a press conference, in your perfect gray suit, with your perfect timing, and you blow up the one man who was already destroying me. And now every camera in Chicago knows my name again. Every news anchor is saying the words foster care and dirty money in the same sentence as my face. You didn't fix anything. You just lit a bigger fire." She stopped, breathed, and said the last sentence in a lower voice, slower, so honest it cut through every layer of paint between them. "You didn't do this for me. You did this because a man like Pemberton dared to touch something you decided was yours." The office went silent. Soft music from the dining room drifted through the wall, distant and muffled. Garrett sat still. 1 second, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. Then he spoke, his voice deep, slow, without defense, without denial. "You're right, and you're wrong. Both can be true." Phoebe looked at him. "Which part is true?" "All of it." He didn't explain further. Didn't say he had vanished because of strategy. Didn't say Buck had warned that any message between them could be turned into a weapon by Neil. Didn't say he hadn't slept for those 3 days. He only sat there and admitted the truth Phoebe had seen, that he had acted for her, and he had acted for himself. And the line between those two things was so blurred that even he couldn't draw it. Phoebe stood in the middle of the room, looking at the man half the city owed money to and the other half prayed never to meet. And she asked the question no lie was big enough to answer. "So what now?" Garrett was silent, and for the first time since Phoebe had known him, the first time since that evening on the balcony of the Drake, she saw something on his face she had never seen before. Not cold anger, not perfect control, not the calm of a man who always knew the next move. Helplessness. Garrett Kessler, the man who could destroy a charity foundation in 3 days and bring one of Chicago's most powerful men to his knees before the press, sat behind his desk and did not know what to say. "I don't know," he said. And those 3 words, to Phoebe, were more honest than anything he had ever said. 2 days after the confrontation at Embers, the files on Lakewood Foundation leaked to the press. Not the kind of leak where someone accidentally dropped documents, but the kind of leak done with intention, with structure, 1 page at a time, 1 number at a time, sent to the right person in the right newsroom at the right moment to create the maximum effect. Tate Corbin left no fingerprints on any envelope, but the fingerprints of precision were everywhere. The Tribune ran the first article, then the Sun-Times, then local television. Within 48 hours, Neil Pemberton's name was tied to the phrases he had spent his entire life avoiding: financial fraud, money laundering through a charitable foundation, shell companies, and tax evasion. Lakewood Foundation was temporarily shut down for investigation. Neil's attorneys filed objections, but no one listened, because once the press had specific numbers and company names, lawyers were only background noise. Neil Pemberton, the man who had once stood at the podium with a charity pin on his lapel and the most confident smile in the room, now did not appear at any event in the city. But the light did not shine only on Neil. When you expose a fraud, people start asking who exposed him, and the name Garrett Kessler began appearing in conversations where he did not want to be present. Not in the newspapers. Garrett was too careful for that. But in worse places, behind closed doors among gray suits in the federal building on the west side of the city. One Wednesday afternoon, 2 weeks after the press conference, a man walked into Embers during a quiet lunch hour. He wore a dark suit, a deep blue tie, came alone, sat at a corner table, and ordered a black coffee. He drank it slowly, looking around the dining room with the eyes of a man memorizing everything, every painting on the wall, every camera angle, every doorway. He did not ask to meet anyone, did not speak to the staff. When he finished, he set the coffee cup down, took a business card from the inside pocket of his suit, placed it on the table beside the cup, and walked out. The staff brought the coffee cup and the business card to Garrett. On the card were 3 letters, FBI, and a phone number. Garrett looked at the business card for a long time, placed it on the corner of his desk, right beside his grandfather's leather notebook, and said nothing. That evening, Buck stood at the office door, hands in his pockets, looking at the business card on the desk, and then at Garrett. "You need distance," Buck said, his voice direct and leaving no room for negotiation. "From her, from the center, from anything clean. Right now, you're on somebody's whiteboard in a federal building. They haven't made a move yet because they don't have anything solid, but if they find a thread between you and that art teacher, they'll pull it until everything unravels. She becomes a person of interest. The center becomes a front. Everything you just saved gets destroyed all over again." Garrett did not argue. He knew Buck was right in the way he always knew Buck was right. With the cold, calculating part of his mind, he used to run an empire. The part that never lied to him no matter how badly he wanted it to. He did not call Phoebe, did not text her, did not send Buck, sent nothing at all. 2 weeks passed in silence, but money was not silent. Tate Corbin set up a legal fund called Southside Arts Initiative, with a clean financial structure passing through 3 layers of audit, not a single thread leading back to Kessler Syndicate. The fund gave Southside Community Arts Center enough support to operate for 2 years. Phoebe was hired full-time, with a salary enough that she did not have to eat instant noodles anymore, and enough for her to buy new paint for the children. The art class reopened. Parents slowly brought their children back as the news about Neil Pemberton covered everything else, and the name Phoebe Aldrin gradually sank out of the headlines, returning to the place she wanted, in the warm shadow of the art room, among children's paintings hanging from clotheslines. 2 weeks after the press conference, Phoebe was rearranging the paint shelf in the art room when she heard a soft knock at the door. She turned and saw Margot Pemberton standing at the threshold. No makeup, jeans and a white t-shirt, hair tied in a ponytail, no jewelry. She looked smaller, younger, and far more tired than the woman Phoebe had first met at this center months ago. "I'm not here because my dad told me to," Margot said, her voice small. "He's not telling anyone anything anymore. I'm here because—" She stopped, swallowed, and Phoebe realized that Margot Pemberton was trying to say something she had never had to say in her life. "I want to help, for real this time." Phoebe looked at Margot, looked for a long time. Not with anger, not with forgiveness, but with assessment. The look of someone who had been betrayed enough times not to trust words, only actions. Phoebe turned back to the paint shelf, picked up a broom leaning in the corner of the room, and handed it to Margot. "We start here." Margot took the broom with both hands, looking at it as if she had never held one in her life, and began sweeping the art room floor, slowly, clumsily, but truly. That week, Josie drew a new picture, larger than the ones before. More people, more colors. In the center of the picture, the yellow sun was still there, but beneath the sun, Josie had drawn many people standing beside one another, tall figures and short figures, hand in hand. And one of those figures, the tallest one, wore something Josie had colored black from neck to waist. Phoebe looked at the drawing and recognized it immediately. It was a suit. Josie had drawn Garrett. 11 o'clock at night, 2 weeks after the last time he had looked at the yellow streak painting through the glass door of the art room, Garrett Kessler sat alone in the office behind Ember's restaurant. The dining room out front had been closed for a long time. The staff had gone home. The kitchen was dark and cold. Only the yellow desk lamp in the office cast its warm light over the oak tabletop, over the stack of papers, over the glass of whiskey he had poured at 9 o'clock and still hadn't taken a sip from. He had sat here every night for the past 2 weeks, and every night had been the same. Paperwork, numbers, reports from Tate, messages from Buck about the FBI's schedule, and the old leather notebook lying in the corner of the desk, silent, patient, as if it knew that sooner or later he would open it. Tonight, he opened it. The worn leather cover creaked open with a familiar sound, the scent of old leather rising faintly, and Garrett turned through the yellowed pages he had read hundreds of times over the past 20 years. His grandfather's handwriting, slanted and sharp, the black ink faded but still readable, each page holding one line, sometimes two, never more. His grandfather had not been a man of many words, either on paper or in life. Garrett turned to the last page, the page his grandfather had written near the end of his life, the handwriting more unsteady than on the earlier pages, the ink darker as if he had pressed the pen harder to make up for a hand that had grown weak. "The only empire worth building is one that stands when you're gone." Garrett read the line, then read it again, then read it once more, and memory came without warning, the way it always did, not a grand or dramatic memory, but the kind of small memory you keep in the deepest place, because it is too simple to tell anyone, and too important to forget. Garrett, 12 years old, sitting on a wooden chair in his grandfather's kitchen, his feet not touching the floor, his hands resting on the table. His grandfather sat across from him, an old man the whole neighborhood called Sir, but no one dared look directly in the eye. The old man placed a book in front of Garrett. Not a book about money, not a book about how the underworld worked. A novel, paperback, old. Its spine cracked from being opened too many times. "Anyone can destroy a room, Garrett, but it takes a real man to build something that people will want to keep," his grandfather said, his voice rough, his eyes on his 12-year-old grandson, with a look Garrett would only understand much later was not sternness, but fear. Fear that the boy would become what he himself had become and could not turn back from. Read. Garrett did not read that book that night, but he read it after his grandfather's funeral, sitting on the wooden chair in the empty kitchen, 13 years old, alone, and read from the first page to the last, not understanding everything, but understanding enough to know that his grandfather had left him 2 inheritances, an empire and a notebook, and he wanted Garrett to know which one mattered more. Garrett closed the notebook, set it on the desk, looked at the untouched glass of whiskey, looked at the phone lying still beside it, the screen dark. Not a single message from Phoebe in 2 weeks, because she hadn't called either. She was keeping her distance too. She was waiting too, even though she didn't know what she was waiting for. He looked at the FBI business card still lying at the corner of the desk. 3 letters and a phone number. A quiet reminder that one wrong move could drag down everything he had just built. Garrett knew the risk. Knew that the FBI agent who had drunk coffee in his restaurant had not come because the coffee was good. Knew that any connection between him and Phoebe could be pulled out, bent, and turned into evidence. Knew Buck would object. Knew everything. And still, a knock sounded at the end of the hallway. Buck walked in, wearing his coat, his eyes still alert even though it was nearly midnight, because Buck was always alert when Garrett was still awake. "You need something?" Buck asked, standing in the doorway, hands in his pockets, reading Garrett's face with 20 years of experience. Garrett did not look up right away. He looked at the leather notebook on the desk for one more second. Then at the business card. Then at Buck. "A takeout box," Garrett said. "2 sets of silverware." Buck did not move. He looked at Garrett. 1 second. 2 seconds. And Buck understood. He didn't ask for whom. Didn't ask, "Are you sure?" Didn't say, "This is a bad idea." He only stood there for another moment. And Phoebe would never know this. But in that moment, across Buck Tanner's scarred face, something passed that looked very much like relief. "I'll have it ready in 10, Buck said. Then he turned, stepped back into the hallway, and closed the door. 8 o'clock at night, in the 3rd-floor studio, Phoebe Aldrin sat in front of the easel, with Pepper curled in her lap, exactly where she had sat every evening for the past 2 weeks, and every evening before that, since she had moved into this room. The room had not changed. It was still so small that if she stretched out both arms, she could almost touch both walls. Still, the smell of acrylic paint mixed with turpentine, a smell she had breathed in for so long she no longer noticed it. The way people no longer notice the smell of their own home. The yellow desk lamp cast warm light over the easel, over the brushes in the jar, over the dried paint streaks on the wooden floor that the landlord had long ago given up hope of ever cleaning. Paintings covered the walls, her own paintings, the children's paintings she had brought home from the center, and in the center of the wall opposite the window, the black and red painting with the yellow streak. 2 weeks without hearing anything from Garrett. Phoebe didn't call, didn't text, didn't ask Buck. She told herself it was the right thing, that distance was necessary, that there were things you couldn't touch without getting burned, and she had been burned enough in her life already. She told herself that every night, and every night it became a little less convincing. Pepper purred in her lap, its blind eyes closed, its ears tilted slightly toward the window, where the sound of the city drifted up from 3 floors below. Phoebe dipped her brush into blue paint, brought the first stroke to the canvas, and the doorbell rang. Her hand stopped. Pepper startled, ears lifting. The doorbell to this studio almost never rang. Mrs. Edna from the 2nd floor knocked directly. Delivery people buzzed from the ground floor. No one rang the bell on the 3rd floor at 8 o'clock at night. Phoebe set the brush down, gently moved Pepper to the chair beside her, walked to the door, and opened it. Garrett Kessler stood in the narrow hallway, the weak fluorescent light on the ceiling falling over him and stretching his shadow across the old tile floor. He was not wearing a suit. For the first time, Phoebe saw him without a suit, only a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled up, the barbed wire tattoo showing beneath the light. In his right hand, he held a takeout box from Embers, a black cardboard box printed with the restaurant logo that she recognized at once. In his left hand, he held a small paper bag, which made a soft clattering sound as the metal silverware tapped together. "You eat yet?" Garrett asked. 2 words. Not an apology for 2 weeks of silence. Not an explanation. Not a promise. Just 2 words. Simple and real enough to cut through everything complicated between them and touch the simplest thing. "Have you eaten?" "I brought food. I'm here." Phoebe looked at him, looked at the food box, looked back into his eyes, and she tried not to smile. She truly tried, because she was still angry, still had unanswered questions, still had a 2-week silence no one had filled. But she couldn't hide it. The corner of her mouth curved up, just a little, enough for Garrett to see, and enough for him to know this door was not closed. Phoebe stepped back, opened the door wider. Garrett stepped into the 3rd-floor studio, and he had to lower his head slightly as he passed through the frame, because the doorway had been made for people much smaller than him. He stood in the middle of the room, and the tiny space should have felt more crowded with a man well over 6 feet tall inside it. But the strange thing was, it did not feel crowded. For the first time since Phoebe had moved here, the studio did not feel too small. It felt just enough. Pepper jumped down from the chair, walked toward Garrett with the cautious steps of a blind cat, sniffed his shoes, sniffed his trouser leg, then sniffed his hand when he bent down. Pepper's nose touched Garrett's fingers. Deciding that this stranger was acceptable, the cat returned to Phoebe's lap, curled up, and closed its eyes. Garrett looked around the room. Paintings across the walls, brushes in glass jars, paint on the wooden floor, the old easel rescued from the trash, the small window looking out over rooftops and the Chicago sky. And his eyes stopped on the black and red painting with the yellow streak, hanging in the center of the wall, where most people would hang the most important painting they owned. He looked at the painting, looked at the furious black strokes Phoebe had painted in the darkness after the gala night, looked at red paint over black, black over red, and looked at the thin yellow streak cutting through all of it, bright, determined, asking no permission. He did not say the painting was beautiful, did not explain its meaning, did not say anything at all. He did not need to, and Phoebe did not need to hear it. The two of them sat down, Phoebe on the only chair, Garrett on the floor with his back against the easel, the food box open between them, wooden silverware in hand, Pepper curled in Phoebe's lap, the yellow streak painting on the wall, and the lights of Chicago glowing outside the small window. They ate. They did not talk much. Sometimes Garrett added more food to Phoebe's box without asking. Sometimes Phoebe looked at him, trying to suppress a smile, only to fail entirely. The small room, the scents of acrylic paint, turpentine, and food from a 5-star restaurant mingling together, Pepper's purring, silverware tapping against cardboard, the sound of the city below, and the silence between them all melded into a stillness that was not the silence of distance, but the silence of two people who had said, enough, been angry enough, been afraid enough, and now only needed to sit beside each other and eat. Because sometimes salvation does not come from clean places, beautifully packaged with ribbons. Sometimes it knocks at the door at 8 o'clock at night, carrying a dinner box and the smell of tobacco on its collar. And if you look closely enough, even in the dark, someone is holding a paintbrush, searching for yellow. If this story touched you, leave a comment below with your thoughts. Share it with someone who needs to know that wounds do not define a person. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now so you don't miss the next stories.